Greetings all, this is Hairy Nick. How is everyone going? We have another card to talk about today in the upcoming Wave 4 release in Brewing With, and today we're going to talk about Angled Deflectors. This card that got everyone really hyped up, and then it seemed like people weren't so afraid of this. It uses the art of Systems Officer. I don't quite know why FFG made this particular person represent angled deflectors. I mean, are they literally angling deflectors in the art? I don't care. It's cool art. I'm glad it's still in the game. But this card does something that's very different. In the last couple of these videos, we spoke about passive sensors and plasma torpedoes. Passive sensors is kind of playing a weird fixed version of Deadeye, and plasma torpedoes is still plasma torpedoes. This kind of effect, though, is very, very unique. It gives any small or medium base ship that has at least one shield the reinforce action at the cost of a shield. That kind of came out of left field. We weren't really expecting an effect like this in the game. Indeed, reinforce is generally considered to be an effect that larger base ships have. It's built into things like decimators and fire sprays. And trying to gauge what this card was going to cost was very interesting while we were all speculating. I first theorized that it would go up in cost against agility. A lot of people said it would actually go down in cost against agility, which is actually what ended up happening. In fact, the cost of this card is 9, 6, 3, and 3 against, respectively, agility 0, 1, 2, and 3. So it goes down quite steeply. It is worth pointing out, currently the only numbers out of all of that mumbo-jumbo that is important is the 6 and the 3s, because there is no ship with 0 agility that can take this. All small and medium base ships have at least 1 agility. The only ships in the standard game that have 0 agility are the VCX 100 and Decimator, which are both large base ships. And trying to gauge what ship wants this effect. And look, before we talk about examples, I am going to make a confession. I am absolutely predicting, out of all these videos I've made in the lead up to Wave 4, this is probably the one I'm going to get the most wrong. It relies on complex interactions. This isn't like passive sensors and plasma torpedoes that really do rely more on the ship frame. I think we're mainly looking at pilot abilities. Things like strong action economy, good reasons to highly value defense, passive offensive mods so we don't have to worry about taking actions for those. These are the key things that we're looking for, and I'm sure I'm going to miss something, so look, as always, in the comment section below, if I did, let me know. But trying to nail down exactly what kind of ship wants this effect, I think the easiest thing to do before we talk about those is actually talk about the ships that don't want this kind of effect. And I think by removing these ships from the conversation, it makes this whole idea a lot easier. I think we're looking at ships with 3 green dice that already have the evade action. Because, while not strictly better, the evade action, especially when you have more dice, in fact the action gets better the more dice you're rolling because you're more likely to see a result that you can convert. This is a key thing, and really you're less likely to get more value out of a reinforced. Now, this is never always strictly the case, because the reinforced token can modify your dice or modify your results more accurately as a recursive effect during an entire round. Sure, an evade token is fantastic and more likely to give you a result, as in increasing the amount of evade results against your opponent's attack dice on a ship with 3 green dice. However, if you're getting shot by several ships, that's not always strictly the case, but probably mostly the case. Also, I think a key thing here is ships that really just don't want to lose that shield. I mean, it's very tempting on ships like the Kiraz fighter, for example, to use this, maybe even put a shield upgrade on, although that gets kind of ridiculously expensive if you add both those upgrades on. But even at that stage, you're only giving the Kiraz a different option for an action, and again, one that's not strictly better than the actions it already has. And of course, the most important thing we don't want to put this card on is ships that already have reinforce. I don't think I need to explain why that is. So let's go through each of these factions and actually talk about some weird and interesting interactions. Again, we're talking mainly about ships with good offensive passive mods. We're talking about ships with good action economy. Also, there is a few cases of ships that actively gain upside as you remove shields from them. And it's important to realise as we look through these, you do have to remember, as you scale down those points against the agility value, it's almost like those shields are more value. Shield Upgrade is a card that is scaled in the inverse way, as in it's more expensive the higher agility. So in actual fact, if you factor that in, if you take away the cost of a shield upgrade on each of the platforms that could go on this, it's essentially the same cost on every single ship. It feels quite balanced. And from that point of view, if you can find ships that really want this effect or really have a good excuse to not have shields, you're actually really pushing the value of this card. And there's a couple of examples of that. Let's start off with the Rebellion and talk about this pilot here, Biggs Darklighter. And it's a pilot that's been very controversial over the course of the game. In first edition, Biggs Darklighter was very problematic in terms of design. If you've ever heard one of the head designers at X-Wing, Alex Davey, talk about him, when he first came on to design for the game, he identified Biggs as a huge problem because he fundamentally undermined the very flow of the game because you messed with targeting priority on your opponent. Now, the new version of Biggs does not do that. The new version of Biggs allows him to shirk damage off other ships onto himself, which doesn't prevent your opponent from just shooting your other ships, but it does mean there is significant downside. As a general rule in X-Wing, you want to stack all of the damage that you are delivering to your opponent's ships onto one ship at a time, so you're increasing the odds of removing those ships one by one and making sure that your opponent has less guns to shoot you back. It's a pretty fundamental part of the game. So Biggs being able to sort of spread out damage is very powerful, and one of the easiest solutions to fly around Biggs is just to shoot him directly. And angled deflectors is an interesting counter to that strategy. Indeed, if you're flying against a Biggs with angled deflectors and you have a lot of very little guns, say you have a TIE swarm or a vulture swarm, angled deflectors does seem to have a decent amount of value. Biggs Darklighter does not have access to actions like Evade, and a focus token is only going to help you on one attack, and even so, it's not guaranteed to happen at all or on multiple dice. And here I think Reinforce does have potential to have some real value. Also, as Biggs is 2 agility, he has the lowest possible buy-in at 3 points for angled deflectors, which is really good. Considering he can make strong use out of it, he doesn't have 3 dice, he doesn't have evade. It feels decent. Now, yes, we are talking about Biggs Darklighter, a pilot that really isn't seeing all that much meta play, but considering Wedge has gone up in points on the X-Wing, and considering the platform is very meta viable in terms of what the Rebellion is doing, I don't think this is completely out of the question. I don't think it's completely guaranteed. I think even if Biggs does see meta play, it might not be with angled deflectors. Remember, losing that shield is a real cost. This might not be worth it at the end of the day, but it just seems like enough things fall into place. And this build alone is only 51 points. So again, if we get back to doing jankyard kind of stuff, which a few cards from this wave coming out seems to indicate might be possible, it's worth having a look at. Let's move over to the Empire, and let's start off with Vader, because this is a pilot that, look, apart from just angled deflectors, has been the topic of conversation with a lot of these cards that we've been looking at in Wave 4. Indeed, I'll just quickly point out this comment made in the last video talking about passive sensors, pointing out the potential for Vader to be able to do extra actions during the engagement phase, and I think this effect is quite interesting. I'm not convinced this kind of effect has enough value to push Vader much further than where he's already going. He already has great value with fire control system, and there's no guarantee because of the timing on Vader. Being initiative 6, there's always a good chance you'll fly last anyway, even without a bid, and at that point, doing something at the point where Vader activates versus the start of the engagement phase, it doesn't actually make any difference. So I'm curious about that effect, but I'm not convinced just yet. I'd love to see it on the table. In terms of his interaction with angled deflectors, this is something that I voiced originally when we saw angled deflectors, when we got to unbox it and show that to the world. And the reason I bring it up on Vader is because of the interaction with Vader's ability. Actions just don't matter. He can basically take as many actions as he likes. If he has angled deflectors, he can focus, target lock, barrel roll, and reinforce. I don't know if you'd want to do that, but it's something you can do. But it's something interesting. And I understand people's arguments against this. I understand that with 3 green dice, with those force tokens, being able to just take a focus token, it is not guaranteed to give you a lot of value. And indeed, it might even be a corner case. I'm just not convinced that this isn't a thing just yet. Because again, we have those cases, and again, reinforce is not strictly better or worse than other dice mods because it's very situational. And I think the fact that it is situational, that you need to be taking a lot of shots all at the same time, is probably going to be the main reason why this doesn't see play if it doesn't. We have to remember that Vader does not have access to the evade action. Indeed, the dev team told us when they first designed Vader and released that before 2nd edition came out that they tested it with evade. It was broken. It was really broken. Now, reinforce might not be better than evade all the time, but it's certainly not far off. It's certainly in not a lot of situations. So I think for that reason, we do have to look at it. Again, it's the cheapest it can be. It's only 3 points on Vader. Yes, taking off that shield does hurt. Shields are very valuable on Vader because it's just so hard to hit him. You're basically helping out your opponent by the factor of 1 shield. I look at that effect. I just can't ignore that. I'm convinced it's going to show up somewhere. That's just all I'm going to say on the matter. Moving over to other platforms on the Empire, a lot of comments I've had about Major Vermeil on the TIE Reaper, and this is quite curious because I think all in all, Angled Deflectors is not going to be like your generic value card that you can just take on any old platform, except in a few key cases. And I think the TIE Reaper actually might just be one of those cases, considering it already has decent passive mods on offense, as Major Vermeil does. It means you can take that defensive token and get some real value out of it. It's only got 1 agility, so the evade action doesn't actually feel all that great. You only get to convert dice with your evade tokens. But reinforce is something you can do on top of rolling an evade. So it feels like a strong option. I know 1 agility ships with evade aren't a very common thing, but it is something to consider. The evade token, whilst always being pretty decent, does lose a lot of value when you only have 1 agility. And lastly, on the Empire, I want to quickly mention Redline. And Redline is a card that might be very scary after this next wave releases. And now that we have plasma torpedoes, he has access to another 9-point torpedo that isn't strictly worse than proton torpedoes. And now he has access to reinforce, something that is very relevant on this platform. Yeah, I am kind of curious to see if Redline can make a bit more of a splash before the next points change. Remember, Redline can take a target lock off the back of any action. That includes this reinforce. So I look at this and I imagine like a Spartan holding up a shield and getting the sword ready, because he's able to prepare his torpedoes as well as defending himself from the front, and that seems like a potentially scary thing to do. Redline was already powerful because he can focus target lock, he can boost target lock to get range. Reinforced target lock seems like a very handy thing, again, especially when he's taking on multiple targets at once, which is something he doesn't usually want to do. He wants to try and joust a single target, but giving him insurance against those other targets actually feels pretty good. And taking off a shield on this kind of platform feels like far less of a downside. It costs 6 points. This is the most expensive that angled deflectors can be. Nevertheless, I think there is a decent amount of value to be had here. Let's move over to the Scum faction, and there's a couple pilots here I want to talk about, although I'm not really convinced that this is going to have much value on the Scum faction. On the Y-Wings, now, yeah, Drea went up in points, but Cavill is an interesting option for this, because on Y-Wings, you can actually build in like this automatic offense machine with agile gunner and dorsal turret, especially on Cavill, who gets to already roll extra dice off any attack of the dorsal turret. So that feels pretty decent. It means when you're using the reinforce, you're not really sacrificing too much from your attack. And honestly, in terms of what's going on with all the Y-Wing pilots right now, I think this is one of the more competitive things you can be doing. Look, I'm not convinced that this is like something that's going to make make the Y-Wing super competitive, but it doesn't seem like a terrible platform, especially when we compare out a decent action economy and a decent offensive mod as a passive effect. And also bear in mind we do have Y-Wings coming out on the Republic, and this is a card that might see play on those, again, if the right things fall into place. Do bear in mind, it does cost 6 points on the Y-Wing, so we're not getting as much value as I would like. I just think it's in the conversation, but I'm not really banking on this to be meta viable. Also in the Scum faction, we have the G1A Starfighter, the Mist Hunter. And this is a curious ship. It used to have the evade action back in 1st edition, although it's only got 1 agility, so again, that evade action wouldn't be great either way. So it doesn't really perform that well in terms of defense. It can be a bit of a points cow, actually. The only main issue here is, yes, the key toys that make this great have increased in points. Advanced Sensors has gone up, although Zuckuss has gone down in points, and Zuckuss is an interesting conversation. I mean, honestly, I think in terms of competitive play, we're still mainly looking at Forlom. Being able to reinforce with advanced sensors, then do a full stop and calculate feels like a lot of fun. Zuckuss's ability to increase the amount of red dice he rolls in order to give your opponent another green dice is generally considered to be a better way to attack because red dice are more likely to roll results than green dice. However, if you're like me and you've tried this effect and one too many times you've blanked out against your opponent's perfect natural rolls on their green dice, this effect can be very frustrating sometimes. Nevertheless, it is interesting. Again, we're talking about being able to get a defensive mod with a passive offensive mod, or a passive offensive mod, I suppose you could say. And I don't hate where Zuckuss is at right now. I think this is a kind of effect that's a lot of fun on the G1A Starfighter. I probably prefer it on Forlom because of the way he can power out calculate tokens. But it's interesting. I think the key thing holding this platform back right now is the fact that advanced sensors went up in points. It was very, very good on this platform, so I don't know. Again, this is another effect that feels like, oh, we're making slightly non-competitive things a bit more competitive, but in terms of meta viability, I think both of these pilots in Cavill and Zuckuss are in the conversation, but I don't really think the Scum faction is where this is at. Let's move along to the Resistance. Okay, we got a couple of really interesting options here. Poe Dameron is another pilot that I was mainly looking at when we first saw this card, thinking, oh, okay, yes, that action economy could use something like that. Considering Poe has the ability to regen his shields with a card like R2 Astromech, something he can make great use of because he's able to fly away, recharge a shield, reinforce the rear, and also focus. That feels like a decent kind of effect. The cost of the shield is significant, but again, we're talking about angled deflectors at only 3 points here. And I suppose we've got to ask ourselves, is it really worth it to lose a shield here? Considering Poe's already Initiative 6 has great agency to boost and barrel roll and focus and do all those kinds of evasive maneuvers when flying away from an opponent's ship. I think it's interesting. I think it's very interesting, especially because of R2 Astromech, because he has the ability to recharge his shields. That means that Poe has agency to negate a lot of the downside here. It's just a question of whether the upside is worth it. Again, it might just be too situational. And of course, the ship that this came with, the Resistance Transport, which oddly enough is not a ship I'm seeing people talk about this card, despite the fact if you have a look at the core design of this card, it seems to actually fit on the Resistance Transport quite well. If you take a look at this build here, for example, it costs 54 points. We have a pilot that, again, can give you just passive offensive mods. A card like Lama Darcy and Coruscella combo together quite nicely, allowing you to take all of those actions and strip your stress and full stop and take actions and do all that kind of stuff while you're shelling your opponent from afar. It seems like a lot of fun anyway. In the turns that you're not reinforcing, you can coordinate your friendly ships. For 54 points, doesn't seem like a terrible option. Might be a bit of fun alongside an A-Wing and a couple of X-Wings. In terms of the support role with the Resistance Transport, I'm pretty much convinced there's going to be at least one meta list that uses this ship. It just is what list that falls into. And it might be this kind of angled deflectors list that can take defensive mods while shooting, also while coordinating. I like the versatility of a build like this, but it might be something with Princess Leia, which is just not interested in this kind of effect. Who knows? That's an interesting concept and a think one that's worth talking about. Also, it has 3 shields and 5 hull, so losing a shield here doesn't feel too bad. Moving over to the First Order. Okay, there's a very interesting interaction we have here with the TIE FO because of this card here, Fanatical. Now, Fanatical is a card that only gives you a benefit. It is a passive offensive mod. Again, those few words that I always love to hear. Passive offensive mods are always something you should watch out for. And it's something that only activates when you're not shielded. Well, guess what? If you take angle deflectors, you're always not shielded. That's scary. And I like Fanatical. It's a card that I think is really, really great. I'm not sure what has more upside. You're shielded, but Fanatical doesn't always work. You're not shielded, which is scary, but Fanatical always works. I know what the most badass answer to that question is, and that's Fanatical and Angle Deflectors. I think Fanatical is a lot of fun, but losing that shield, man, it's rough. It's really, really rough. And at the end of the day, are you going to be using that reinforce? And then what are you doing? You're spending 3 points just to lose a shield. That feels really bad. It feels terrible, actually, if I'm to be honest. But again, there are situations when you will reinforce, but when your ship's being swarmed, is a reinforce on a ship with only 3 hull really going to save it? It might, but it's not likely. It already has evade. And I think while this combination is cute, I think that's what you really do have to appreciate. There is real cost with taking angle deflectors. And I'm not convinced that having Fanatical switched on all the time is really enough upside. It's a good card. I don't think it's a great effect. Again, it's a passive offensive mod, which is good to have, but I don't think having this card always on, as opposed to most of the time being switched on, makes it significantly better. So I'm going to say right now, no, I'm not convinced that Angle Deflectors in the TIE FO is something that's going to be super meta viable, but there's always going to be that one guy at your LGS who runs it and just smashes everyone by just getting all that value out of Fanatical. It's fun. It's fun. Never discredit something for being fun. Moving over to the Republic, and I think there's one ship that is interested in this, and no, it's not the Jedi Starfighter. Do not remove that shield of the Jedi Starfighter, you will regret it. But the Arc 170 on the Republic specifically is something I'm interested in because it does have those passive effects that I think makes angle deflectors a bit more palatable. At 6 points on a pilot like, say, Wolf, it doesn't feel too bad. Wolf is already a pilot that wants to fly aggressively. He wants to fly fast at your opponent's ship so he can joust and overtake and activate that flippy arc ability, weird charge thing he has on his card. And because of that, angle deflectors feels a bit better. The more aggressively you fly your opponent's ships, the more likely you are to be shot by several of your opponent's ships, probably with more die. There's also pilots like Sinker that provides your other friendly ships with dice rerolls, and that is an ability which does tend to aggro opponents. Removing a ship like this and getting more than the value of a ship off the board, also taking dice mods away from other ships, is the kind of effect that makes a lot of opponents go, well, I'm just going to remove that ship first, and giving that kind of platform reinforce feels interesting. And yeah, I'm interested on the Arc 170 on the Republic. I'm not really interested on it in other ships. I don't think, like on the N1 Starfighter, we're really curious about that effect. Indeed, with the Jedi Starfighter, calibrated laser targeting did come down in points in the last points change, and I think for that reason, it may be very interested in that. That takes up the mod slot, and it's definitely more desirable than this kind of effect. And lastly, the Separatists, and just like the Scum faction, I don't think this faction is really interested in this effect. Indeed, there's currently just the one ship that can take it in the Belbalub. Even as Wave 5 releases when we get the Nantex, that still has no shield, so it's not something that we're going to have access to much on this faction because they just like to have ships without shields. And in terms of the Belbalub, it already has access to cards like Soulless One and Impervium Plating. It's a point cheaper than Impervium Plating, but I like the way Impervium Plating plays with the design of the Belbalub. Angle Deflectors alongside Soulless One does not seem crazy to me. But again, in terms of the way the pilots are designed, either this is a great support chip for your Vulture droids, or you're flying something like General Grievous and you're generally trying not to get shot anyway. Now look, yeah, that's always the thing. If your game strategy is not coming together and you need to hedge against your opponent's headhunting General Grievous, might be an interesting effect to have. I just think at the point when you're losing that much value on your pilot ability, something like Angle Deflectors isn't going to save you. Plus again, I must bring up the point that you are losing a shield in order to get this effect, so if your Grievous is getting headhunted with Angle Deflectors, then having Reinforce just might not save him. And that's the key thing here. I don't think there's any crazy combos with this. Things like Poe, Vader and Redline, I'm curious about to see if somebody can break that. But with a lot of these effects moving into 2nd edition, FFG do seem to have been a lot more conservative. A lot of things that back in 1st edition would have been just downright broken. I mean, I get the impression if this was a 1st edition card, it would just give Reinforce and it wouldn't take the shield away. That's the kind of environment shift we're moving into in 2nd edition. And I think overall, that's a good thing. Again, in the comment sections below, if you have any other combos you want to talk about with this card, please let me know. I apologise if you can hear that rain overhead. It just started raining and we have a tin roof in this house, so that might be quite loud. In the meantime, do not forget to like and subscribe, like me on Facebook, follow me on Twitter and Reddit. Please consider supporting my Patreon. To all my patrons, thank you so much for your help in making these videos. We have a Patreon Discord where we discuss all of these things before I make them. So if you want to be part of that, in the description below we have the links to the Patreon and all that kind of stuff. It explains on Patreon how to become a part of that. But for now, I'll catch you in the next video.